to the freedom alternative. A while ago, I uploaded a video called The Sad Childhood Under Communism Part 1, which you can watch here, and I promised then that I'll upload Part 2 when Lucian Pavel, the original author, will publish the second part of the series. Well, he did, so now I'll bring it to you. As usual, original text on the screen whilst I translate into English in the background. I should mention that I may cut a bit from the text, not because of length concerns, but because it contains some references that would take a lot to explain and are not exactly relevant for the fans of this series, since it delves in a lot into post-communist politics. Anyway, we'll see. So, it goes like this. The Sad Childhood Under Communism Part 2. I'm picking up from where I left it in the first part with my childhood and teenage years lived under the communist regime. I do this more for the extraordinary young men and women of present day who are deeply moved by what I've said in the first part, and also because the first part started some controversies and recollections. To my astonishment, I received quite a diverse bag of reactions, starting with the outright denial by some, most likely those who feel guilty for implementing the murderous regime, or on the contrary, those who would want back the privileges they used to have as apparatchiks and or prominent members of the Communist Party or the Securitate. On the other hand, I did receive approval and support, but also a lot of comments attempting to compare the life of teenagers back then with the life of teenagers of today. I will say that such a comparison can't even begin to be made because everything is different. Individual and group liberties are now fully granted, but the quality of taxpayer-funded education and some other public services has dwindled, not because of the market economy, but because the power was still held by the descendants of the nomenclatura. Now, I agree with Mr. Pavel that the quality of public education has slightly decreased, but that's a Europe-wide phenomenon. Sweden, for instance, wasn't ruled by Soviet apparatchiks, yet that didn't stop the Swedish education system to become neighbor with Romania in PISA tests. Anyway, that's a separate discussion and I'll skip the rest of the paragraph and move on to the part with the stories. Anyway, quote, "Let's continue with the memories from those times. When I was around 14, I began to observe much closer who were those who were lauding the dear leaders and the Communist Party. I had soon realized that the rotten that was the compromise with the regime had taken over all the sectors of the society, from culture to education, and from the healthcare system to the collective farms, all of them ran by the state, of course. You see, the state and the party was in everything. The actors and the singers who had made our childhood nicer in the children's movies of the 60s and 70s were now up on the grandiose stages of the reverential spectacles put out by the party in which they would recite the libidinous poems or the masterpieces dedicated to the communist structures and to the downright sickening Ceausescu couple. These compositions were in many cases authored by utterly anonymous and irrelevant people that had no artistic value. However, in time, many of the valuable people in the Romanian music and literature have accepted the compromise with the regime and wrote poems and songs for the propaganda machine, thus putting a permanent stain on their record. I, for one, was utterly disgusted by this gratuitous obsequiousness that I hadn't really seen in the other nations behind Stalin's Iron Curtain. As such, I can't forget this so easily." And there the author is putting a picture with Corneliu Vadim Tudor, who after 1989 went on to make a fascist party. All habits die hard. And our author says about the picture, quote, "Here's Corneliu Vadim Tudor, a hardly known ass-kisser of Elena Ceausescu, allegedly a writer and journalist, standing side by side with the evil propagandist of the dictator, the founder of the national communist propaganda machine for the youth, Adrian Păunescu. Mind you, Adrian Păunescu was a valuable poet, but he comprised himself for good when he decided to essentially become a Goebbels of communism." Then the article continues, quote, "I should probably say a bit more about the brainwashing instrument that was the Flacăra Cenacle, at which I would go for the few non-politicized folk and rock songs. Otherwise, it was very annoying with a lot of nationalist communist-themed songs. But it was a compromise I was willing to make in order to see the quality stuff that would be allowed on the stage. At one point, it was anyway the only form of mass entertainment in the 1980s. I still remember the famous pornographic episodes that would sometimes occur behind the stages. Those of us sitting close by would see how some of the artists were swarming with more or less versed chicks. Anyway, enough on this topic because I already spoke too much about the regime's choirs of up-kissers. My parents and grandparents would comment by making fun at the things presented in the short TV programs. They'd poke fun at the TV presenters and the heads of the party that were promoted by the propaganda machine. As such, we, the children, understood from the very early age that this regime was against the nature and thus grew up rejecting the slattern propaganda. We would sometimes change the lyrics of the patriotic or communist songs and poked fun amongst ourselves on the brazen propaganda. We were, however, at the same time fearful that we might one day be forced to make such compromises ourselves too. One example that I still remember is the goodbye song one would sing when leaving the students' camp. The song was called Goodbye Dear Camp, and the poor students renamed it Goodbye Empty Booth, following the severe shortages they'd suffer throughout the 2 weeks in there. Now, some clarification is needed here. Back in the days of communism, it was customary, or indeed quite normal, for students to go in some remote camp in the vacations, allegedly to have fun and maybe learn something about nature. The idea itself wasn't necessarily a bad one, but as with many other communist things, in practice it was largely less than awesome. Sure, the students sometimes had fun, but more often than not, they'd live on very little food unless they bought some from home. As for the song, well, it preys on an anagram that makes sense in Romanian. Tabă means camp in Romanian, whilst tarabă means booth or stand, and it refers to the booth existent in the farmers' markets, which were also more often than not rather empty, especially during the severe shortages of the 1980s. Anyway, back to the article. Quote, I also suffered from hunger when I was at the Sălătuc Comunești camp. I think it was in 1986. They were feeding us a horrible food, some bizarre mush that I was to meet with again during my mandatory military conscription. Since we were severely hungry, me and a few other colleagues caught 2 or 3 small chickens at the edge of a forest nearby, went on the shores of a small river, disrobed them, made a fire and cooked them on the spot and ate them. I'm not proud at all by this, but we had no other way of getting anything to eat. There were no stores in the camp and we weren't allowed to go into the nearby village. Quite frankly, it resembled more of a concentration camp than a vacation camp. That pamphlet song followed me many years after and remembered me about yet another utterly compromised vacation, communist style. Essentially, we were making fun of trouble, just like the rest of the multilaterally developed socialist society. In fact, the mental protection system against the propaganda which aimed to create the new man, Homo Bolshevicus, developed itself mainly through jokes at the expense of the regime. Countless jokes have been composed mocking Ceausescu, the Securitate, the opportunistic commies with important positions without any competence, the zealous Stakhanovists, or the Yerevan Radio, which was a fictitious radio station in the Soviet Union, which explained with subtle humor the stupidity of this paranoid regime. No matter how vigilant was the Securitate's repression, the only form of mass dissidence was even more creative. Rumor had it that these creative people were from the ranks of the party, though I highly doubt about that. There were also organized humor groups that would make us laugh with subtle jokes at the expense of the regime, such as the group Divertis or VOA, groups whose jokes would routinely get through the party's censorship filter because those enforcing the censorship weren't bright enough to catch the subtleness. We would enjoy unapologetically the jokes of these groups and we couldn't conceive the idea of missing any of their shows. We were getting out of the auditorium with the muscles of our cheeks literally blocked after how much we had laughed. We then had material to use in our stories for those in the neighborhood who had missed the show. Amongst the jokes that were famous at the time, I remember the one concerning the escalation of the arms race because of Ceausescu, who decided to put anti-aircraft missiles on civilian buses. See the picture. This was a reference to the huge gas tanks placed on the buses because of the severe shortages of gasoline and diesel fuel. There was also the joke with Brezhnev's funeral, at which Corina Chiriac appears and starts singing Opri Zdricu să uce și neanicu, which essentially translates as stop the hears so Ceausescu can join in, which was a reference to the old age of the dear leader and the fact that it was about time that he would step down. One day I'll make a video solely with commie jokes. Man, Mr. Pavel is absolutely right. There are millions of jokes composed back in communism, and that's only those that have been heard in Romania. There are also some fabulous Russian jokes at the expense of the Soviet Union. Many of them are translatable into English. Seriously, I'll get down to that and translate those that don't need long explanation. Anyway, let's go back to the article. Quote, In the school and in other fields, I would notice how the tendency of the communist policy was to uniform the society, based on the idea of perfect equality between people and classes, which was promoted everywhere. As a child and then teenager, I would see how some of my colleagues with real qualities were subjected to chicanery by the system and discouraged to prove their qualities, especially if they were coming from families with unhealthy origin, that is to say, they had relatives who served time in jail for political crimes. On the other hand, the kids of the commies, Securitate officers or militia members, were promoted and supported and in many cases placed into cushy jobs that guaranteed their accession in time into the system's structures. Entire generations were put off because obedience to the system was rewarded whilst competence was purposefully disregarded. They would routinely send the one who graduated first in his or her generation to do work in the most remote corners of the nation, thus fueling this surfeit. These shenanigans would make one think twice on whether there was any point in standing out through competence or, on the contrary, on whether there may be a better idea to just pretend to be a yes-man robot of the regime and then use some relationship to get a job closer to friends and family. All of these provided the fuel for a growing anti-system aversion in my mind, making me to refuse to accept and to conform to the rules. In my mind, I was thinking that I was punishing the system by refusing to study further or regularly going to school. In fact, I should have done the other way around, to study harder, practice my mind and skills, and prove that I can be better than them. Without realizing, I was actually playing the commies' perfidious game. Other youngsters would wander on the streets also from an ardent desire to disobey the regime. Others were intentionally wearing blue jeans and long hair, rock metal style, solely for the purpose of distinguishing themselves from the grey and inert mass of people with short hair and party-approved bangs. More and more youngsters would manifest themselves essentially anti-everything communist, and for bloody good reasons. An episode that I want to mention comes from the last 2 years of communism, if not the last year, when at the usual food lines, a few 16 to 18-year-old youngsters, happy that some crappy chicken meat had been brought, started making subtle jokes about the regime that was starving them, about the fact that we're eating top-notch imported cuisine, a reference to the Vietnamese crappy chicken food, and similar jokes in this fashion. During this ad hoc fun at the expense of the communist regime, the youngsters didn't realize that there were Securitate officers in line, or maybe some neighbors who routinely snitched to the party. Who knows? What's known for sure is that the secret police picked them up the next day and received severe beatings close to being killed. And this ordeal lasted for months. Then the parents were also brought for interrogation, thinking that these youngsters weren't alone in their hostile manifestation against the regime, but rather picking it up from their families. The 1989 moment came, and so they got away alive from the ordeal, but some of them couldn't bear to live nearby the Securitate brutes, so they permanently emigrated, mostly to the United States. The picture there shows the kind of chicken one would have to sit for hours in line for the privilege of buying it. Thanks a lot to Mr. Pavel for the photos. It's hard to find such photos because most people never took pictures of these details. Anyway, going further with the article, quote, "Also, for the purpose of community and family disintegration, the regime would send the last-year students from the Communist Youth League to do heavy work in the fatherland's megalomania construction sites. Also, conscripted soldiers would also do heavy work in mines or the People's House, the huge Soviet-style building imagined by Ceausescu to shelter the headquarters of the absolutist power. Thousands of young men across the nation have died on these construction sites as they had no qualification to work in these fields, but were merely cannon fodder. As a high school student, I was also sent to do work at the Machines and Special Tools Enterprise. There I could see live the bankruptcy of the mammoth with clay feet built by the dictator with loaned money from the IMF, which he returned by starving the people. Thousands of employees were working on the stock, building merchandise that even other Warsaw-packed nations wouldn't buy. The personnel scheme was so bloated that the graduates of 1988 could no longer be taken by that enterprise. And of course, neither could the next graduates in the last year of the Ceausescu regime. Their fate, if they couldn't pass the entrance exam for college, obviously they would be sent to the coal mines in Oltenia and Hunedoara. But the city-educated youngsters could sometimes avoid becoming miners by activating PCR, or Pile Cunoștințe Relații, another abbreviation of the Communist Party. Okay, another clarification is needed. For starters, the author lived in Iași, that is in the northeastern part of the country. The coal mines in Oltenia and Hunedoara are in the southwestern part of the country. Essentially, those graduates were sentenced by the regime to move 800 to 1,000 kilometers away from home at the age of 18 or 19. Something that doesn't sound that bad today, but it did sound awful in the perpetual shortages of the regime and the fact that they'd have to work in coal mines. Also, on the PCR thing, this one is quite hard to explain in full in English, but I'll try. PCR officially means Partidul Comunist Român, the Romanian Communist Party. However, given that the system was entirely corrupt, just like it was and is anywhere where communism is allowed to exist, a second abbreviation emerged amongst the populace, namely Pile Cunoștințe Relații. All three of these words essentially mean relationships, in the sense that I know someone who knows the party secretary that can arrange you for a good job. To a much lesser extent, this applies in a free market too. It's called networking. Many companies make a hire after someone from the inside suggests a candidate. But I say this happens to a much lesser extent in a free market because if the employee hired on such nepotism doesn't confirm, he or she is eventually fired. Whilst under communism, such an employee could never be fired, especially if he or she was recommended by someone from the higher echelons of the party. Anyway, one more paragraph in the article. There are many other things to say, but for the moment I'll stop here. In future episodes, I hope to include individual memories and adventures of other kids and teenagers from those times, hopefully with pictures. I hope I'll get as many reactions as I got to the first episode, and depending on them, I'll decide how to continue this series. I'll repeat what I've said at the beginning of this episode. There's just no way to compare how kids live today with how I used to live. We actually do have the possibility now to offer far more to our children, yet some of us are too complacent in the face of the state's aggression, almost like in a Stockholm Syndrome type of situation when the victim empathizes with the aggressor. It's time that we're left alone to raise our children in liberty, in entrepreneurial spirit, and in the natural meritocracy, where the one who's more intelligent, competent, talented, or more hardworking gets more than the one who's nifty or feeble. Alright, this concludes the second part of Lucian Pavel's series. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did, although some of his references are damn hard to explain in English. I guess with some of this kind of puts me on the situation to hurry up with making a 20-minute video about how things evolved after communism fell, something which I keep on postponing because it takes a lot of time to research, and it's time that I don't really have right now. Not to mention that it's not a topic popular anyway, but yeah, we'll see. Also, if you want to see more from this series of memories from communism, check out this playlist, and I hope you'll enjoy those. And with that being said, don't forget to click the subscribe button, follow me on Twitter at FreedomAlternat, and consider supporting this channel because digging up these stories and translating them ain't easy. Anyway, talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching.